So in chapter 18, we're going to be tackling progressivism, and I've split the chapter into two different parts. Part one is going to be looking at the urban landscape of the city and how progressivism develops within the city. Obviously, the focal point of progressivism is the urban landscape. And so we'll talk a little bit about that. And then we'll move into part two, where we start looking at it in terms of politics. But what is progressivism? It's a broad-based reform movement, and it seeks to change problems that arise out of American society. So when you look at the chart to the right, it shows, like women's rights, temperance, socialism, conservatism, conservation. All of these things are things that progressivism addresses, but it's so much more, and it's hard to wrap this up into one chapter and be all-encompassing. So just keep in mind that, as I said before, the city is really the focal point for progressivism, because you have so many people living on top of each other, and there a lot of these social ills that the progressives are trying to solve exist in the city. That's not to say that there isn't progressivism in the rural areas of the country, because there are, or that progressivism doesn't change things in the rural areas, because that's just not true. And we'll talk more about some of those things as we move through. But we're looking at roughly from 1900 to 1917, and our two real big kind of political figures are Teddy Roosevelt and Woodrow Wilson. In terms of immigration, this kind of goes along with what I was saying about the city being the focal point. We are a country at this point in time between 1860 and 1920 on the rise, that it's growing. Both rural and urban areas are growing really pretty fast. Cities are probably expanding faster than the rural areas. But you can definitely tell by the 1920s that, we're talking pretty large-scale population in both areas. And you can see also in these charts how big the city or cities are growing and becoming during this time period. Between 1815 and 1914, this is a period of phenomenal growth and movement. You see a great deal of people coming out of Europe and going to the United States, to South America, and other places on the globe. But one of the things to consider is what is going on within these areas where we have the arrows emerging out of. So what's happening that's causing people to leave there? And a lot of it is political instability. Sometimes it's climate. It can be climate, and we do have warming trends in Europe, and that's often the cause of a lot of people leaving and moving into other areas. But one of the big things to think about is the ease in which people can move. Between Europe and the United States, you have shipping lines, passenger ships that are moving back and forth. It's pretty easy for a low-income family who may not have a lot of assets to just pick up and leave and head to the United States. And at this point in time, really in the late 1800s, early 1900s, this is really extremely easy for them to do. It's not a major investment as it would have been earlier. And we see within the city, this is a diagram in Chicago. Each of the different colors represents a different nationality or ethnicity. And all of these people are living on top of each other in crowded conditions usually. Not a lot of sanitation, not a lot of health. And this is one of the reasons why progressivism picks up in the urban areas. But it's interesting to note that, we've got people who are living next to each other who sometimes don't even share the same language, same religion, culture, foodways, any number of things. And so, this is where we start getting the idea of the American melting pot, where everybody just kind of comes from wherever they're from and they blend into America. America is an immigrant nation. Um, and there's no better example of this than during this period in United States history. So, positive effects of industrialization, talking about innovations and inventions, job creation, wealth, immigration, capital, and urbanization. Um, when we think of this period, this is a period of incredible innovation. There's something like, 1,000 or 2,000 patents that are issued from the 1789 until like the 1870, and then all of a sudden there's like 200,000 patents that are issued within a 10-year period. It's ridiculous in terms of how much innovation is going on. Of course, job creation is fueled by the economy, fueled by capitalism in the factories, which of course bleeds into the wealth category. This is a period of enormous wealth. There are men who literally, within their lifetime, have migrated to the United States, like Andrew Carnegie, comes to the United States as an immigrant and becomes one of the wealthiest citizens in the United States history. And that's largely due to immigration, but also to opportunity. The opportunity for him is really unbelievable. So some of the negative effects of industrialization, obviously pollution, diseases are spread very easily, but pollution of water and air. There are no regulations on any of these things. So companies like, the Union Stockyards are dumping gallons and gallons of soiled and just nasty water into the river with no repercussions or no concern, because nobody's saying this isn't the right thing to do or this is going to kill people. These are things that we will learn as we move forward. Poverty, how does industrialization impact poverty? When you've got a company that's focused on profits and wants to reduce overhead, they're going to offer the cheapest wages possible, and there are no stipulations for welfare or insurance or any protections for workers. So this is how capitalism is allowed to kind of operate unrestricted. Working conditions are dangerous. You have a high number of injuries and deaths in the workplace. The hours are very long. Living conditions, you're overcrowded. You have lack of inspections or regulation in terms of how people are living. They're living on top of each other. We'll talk more about that when we talk about the tenements. Wages are low. You have no labor laws in place to protect women and children in terms of being sources of labor. You have a huge inequity of wealth, and we'll talk about that a little bit later. Obviously corruption, because we've already seen that in the populist movement with the patronage system. And so you have a lot of these things that are created, and this is what progressivism is attempting to solve, are the negatives from industrialization and urbanization. And of course, it spreads throughout the country. It's not just isolated to the city, as I've said, but the city becomes the focal point. So when we're talking about tenements were these large multi-story living spaces for families. They were considered to be ahead of their time in the sense that they were designed to let air flow through the building. So you could open a window at one end, open the other end, and air was supposed to flow and keep disease and, bad air from flowing around the house. The idea was that, it would keep the airflow going so you wouldn't have as many diseases. And of course, this is early. People aren't really understanding germs and all of that yet. And then taking advantage of natural light. All of these tenements had a yard in the back so that children could play, or people could go outside and enjoy the natural light. I'll show you some pictures in a second. You will not understand why they would want to do that. Shared water sources meant disease spread easily. Cholera was a big killer in the cities. But within the rooms, you see all these little kind of rooms that's carved up. The building's carved up into these tiny rooms. Imagine 6 to 7 people living in the bedrooms, and that's typically what happened. Um, the tenement design was for like a normal family, but immigrants moved in mass and didn't have a lot of money, and so they typically would live literally on top of each other. We'll see some pictures of that as well. By 1865, you had a little over 15,000 tenements in New York City. By 1900, you had 2.3 million people living in tenement housing, which was over 2/3 of the New York population. That's pretty substantial. Um, and so we'll talk more about tenements. Joseph Rees and he's technically a muckraker, which we'll talk about muckrakers in a second, but he started off as a photographer and journalist. He would cover the police beat. And so when police were called to a location, he would often go with them and take pictures. And he started walking around and realizing that there were huge issues within the tenements. And so these are some pictures of his that he took. The picture in the left, of course, is a bedroom. And as I mentioned, you have multiple people living within this bedroom. You have people living on the floor. They'll just throw down a rug or a sheet or something like that, and that's what they would be living on. And then in the back, where the yard was, this was also where you would have the bathrooms. And so, you have these clotheslines hanging out there, and then, of course, the toilets for the people living within the tenement. Definitely not somewhere where you would want to be kind of hanging out and playing as a child, but, it was really the only place you could go. And Rees publishes a book entitled How the Other Half Lives, and he's talking about proper housing for the tenements and the people living in the tenements. And he talks about how the upper class, and we'll see some examples of this, lives compared to the working class, the people who are keeping the wealthy in the style to which they become accustomed. So a muckraker is someone who brings up, the idea is that you're bringing up muck, you're raking muck, you're stirring it up. But it was the idea that you were focusing on the ills of society and trying to kind of expose what's wrong with society. Ida Tarbell is a great example. She wrote a book about Standard Oil and then did a tell-all on John D. Rockefeller. And she exposes the business practices of the Standard Oil Company and how they undermine competition and force competition out of business. Her books on both Rockefeller and Standard Oil lead to the Standard Oil Company being, or the founders of the Standard Oil Company being charged with corruption and fraud. And I believe there's a court in Texas that I think attempted to arrest John D. Rockefeller and Henry Flagler and some of the other heads of Standard Oil. Of course, they weren't because they had really good attorneys. But the tide of public opinion really turns against Rockefeller and Standard Oil after Tarbell's exposés. Lincoln Steffens is another political corruption muckraker who highlights how corrupt the cities are in terms of their patronage system and the political machines. William English Walling was a social reformer, and that's his picture too on the right. He ends up helping found the NAACP. He is one that is a social reformer in the sense of not only the races, but also in terms of helping the poor and being a champion of the working class. During the Gilded Age, we have the creation of what many historians and sociologists refer to as the leisure class. Um, and really, where this begins to develop is under Thorstein Veblen's book, The Theory of the Leisure Class in 1899, that begins to look at the upper crust of the cities, like the Rockefellers or the Vanderbilts, um, and this concept called conspicuous consumption. And basically, what this is the wealthy go to extremes in order to identify themselves as wealthy. So they may build, an enormous house that looks like a chateau um, on Fifth Avenue. They spend a great deal of money with the idea that it will show how much wealth they have. Hopefully that makes sense. And we'll talk a little bit more about what conspicuous consumption looks like in a second. Andrew Carnegie's The Gospel of Wealth is one of your sources that you'll be reading. But think about the position of wealth that people have, like these capitalists like Carnegie and Vanderbilt, and what role does that mean for them within society? And keep in mind the idea of social Darwinism. When Herbert Spencer starts talking about the idea of survival of the fittest, these capitalists begin to think about the fact that, okay, I'm at the top of society. That means I've been chosen for some reason by something that I've done. I've made the right decisions, and so I was destined to be a leader of society. And Carnegie gets kind of entrenched in this idea and writes this piece called The Gospel of Wealth, that basically he says, don't give money out to poor people, or don't just give them money, make them work for it as well. And Carnegie's not the only one who believes this. When people would approach Henry Flagler for money in Florida to build churches or schools, Flagler would often require that they raise a portion of the money themselves before he would write a check. He just would not give out money just give it to somebody. There were always strings attached. Horatio Alger is a character who appears in a number of stories, and these there are 3 of them shown there at the bottom. And these are the rags to riches stories. The idea that pluck, meaning bravery or courage, and luck will get you far. And so you have someone who literally grows up poor, but works really, really hard, and it ends up becoming wealthy. And so this part of the mythology of the leisure class is that it's possible for the average American to work their way up into the leisure class. It's not really true. That's why it's mythology, but it is kind of a neat idea for a lot of people. And so, it helps to make the elite not appear to be so corrupt. But it gives the idea that the average person has the ability to get there, to become like a Andrew Carnegie or John D. Rockefeller. So the leisure class are really the first to enjoy this idea of leisure. Leisure prior to the 1870s would have been really unheard of because people were literally working all the time. It was very odd for people to have leisure time to themselves or to do whatever they wanted to do. And so the leisure class, or the wealthy capitalists, began to take this idea of free time or leisure and make it work for their social status. And one of the first things they do is they start to build the country estates. So if you go to New York, go on Long Island and around kind of upstate New York in terms of the Hudson River, if you go up the Hudson River, you'll find a lot of large estates that were built for the capitalists for them to escape during the summer. And typically, what they would do was they would go to these homes in the mountains because it was cooler and because during the heat of the summer, diseases tended to spread very easily. And so there was a practical aspect of it as well. But these estates, like their homes in New York City on Fifth Avenue, would have been lavish and large scale. Um, and it spreads into other areas of the country. So Florida, Saratoga Springs, which was an upstate New York um, place where a lot of people went during the summer, in Newport, Rhode Island. So these homes take on a whole different meaning when you look at them. The picture at the bottom right is the breakers in Newport. Huge home, enormous, and there's no doubt that if somebody were to see that house, they would realize that the family that lives there is very wealthy. And that's what conspicuous consumption is. You're spending money in order to appear as an elite member of society. Fashion for women and men changes as well. You have leisure outfits that you would wear while you're on holiday or staying at one of these homes. The expectation was that they were the finest material possible. And so women would have these, incredibly intricate dresses and outfits, as well as the men, that would again reinforce their status in society. Furnishings and interior spaces as well. You build these large homes that look like castles. And so on the outside, they're huge. On the inside, they're lavish and very expensively decorated. And you're creating kind of an American aristocracy. And this was a very deliberate plan by the leisure class in order to elevate their status in American society. But it also creates a process by which the rest of America begins to emulate them. They want to be them. They want to be just like them. And so, like with the royals, if you had a prince come by and shake your hand, you have all this respect for that person. Now, whether or not they deserve it, they get it. And so you have this idea that they are where they should be because of something that they've done or they've accomplished something magnificent. And so, therefore, this emulation begins to develop. Leisure class, in terms of local aspect, Jekyll Island's a great example. This was a private island for the millionaires. They had the clubhouse, which you see there on the right in the center, and then they had their cottages surrounding it. And when we go on vacation, you go places like Disney World or somewhere where you get away. For them, there was really no getting out of society. Wherever you went, you were always constantly aware of what other people thought of you, and you always made sure that you were dressed appropriately, that you stayed in a building or hotel, of equal to your status. And the people surrounding you, the people that were staying at the hotel, were supposed to be people of the same status as you. So you didn't just go stay anywhere and expect that, you would hang out with anybody from any kind of class. No. You definitely stayed where other wealthy people live or stayed, and you socialized with those people on the same social level. Newport, Rhode Island, again, this is the Breakers. Very quaint looking home, I would think. And it's not unusual for the Vanderbilts or whoever might be living in these homes to import antiques and furnishings from Europe. In some cases, they would import an entire room and reassemble it in the home. But you can tell this is not the same picture that you see in the tenement houses of New York. So I thought I'd throw in a kind of an interesting story. the Astors had always been kind of the creme de la creme of New York society. And so the story was that Mrs. Astor had her dining room was able to hold about 400 people. And so the people that she would invite to dinner were considered the Astor 400 or the New York 400. The idea was that Mrs. Astor determined who was the creme de la creme of New York society. So you have this woman named Alva Smith, who's born and raised in Mobile, Alabama, but schooled in Paris. Family comes from family's very wealthy. She marries Commodore Vanderbilt's grandson, William Kissam Vanderbilt. And so she wants to arrive in New York society. She wants to be part of New York society. So how do you do this? Well, Alva Vanderbilt built this enormous house. She decided to have a party to celebrate the opening of the house. So she invited newspapers to see the decorations for the party. She would talk up with her friends, about the event. Invitations went out, and unfortunately, the Astors did not receive an invitation. And so Mrs. Astor's daughter approached her mother and said, "Well, Mother, I don't understand why I did not get an invitation to this party. This is going to be the party of the century." So her mother approaches Mrs. Vanderbilt and asks her, why didn't we get an invitation? And Mrs. Vanderbilt's response is, "Well, you never called on me." In those days, you would go by and visit their house and visit with them, on a certain day of the week. And so ends up being that Mrs. Astor comes over and visits with Mrs. Vanderbilt, and they get an invitation to the party. Now, these pictures that you're seeing are people's costumes or especially ladies, costumes for this party, this open, quote unquote, open house. The picture to the left is Mrs. Vanderbilt in a dress that was called, I think it was the electric dress, because there was a battery pack in the dress, and she could hold that lantern in her right hand up. She could hold it and it would light up, and the whole dress would light up. The picture to the right, not the one with the birds, but with a woman with a cat on her head, that was her favorite cat, and when the cat died, she had it stuffed and made into a hat. Bizarre. And then the picture all the way to the right is Mrs. Vanderbilt. But one of the things to think about is the lavishness with which they spent money in for these parties. And they would never, ever wear the dresses again because you couldn't do that. It wasn't done. But this is a good way to kind of illustrate how you kind of bust your way into New York society. So as we talked about already, what a consumer economy is, what consumerism is. Consumer economy is driven by consumer spending as a percent of its gross domestic product, as opposed to other components of the GDP. So we're looking at really a focus on getting people to spend money. And consumerism is the social and economic order that encourages the acquisitions of goods and services. So the economy, the consumer economy, is what describes the economy. Consumerism is the behavior. So we're looking for advertising and marketing, which of course come about during this period. And you can see some of the advertisements. Installment loans and lines of credit become very popular because they're trying to make goods, and especially luxury goods like cameras are a great example. You didn't have to fork out money on the front end. Like if it were $1,000, for example, you wouldn't have to pay $1,000. You could pay $250 a month, or open up a line of credit and that sort of thing. So people are beginning to experiment with installment loans and lines of credit at this time. Luxury items like automobiles, huge, huge, huge market here. And this is conspicuous consumption in its finest, because people would buy home or buy cars, um, and you could get a installment loan for them. But as you can see in these advertisements, the idea is cultivation and refinement. So if you were a middle class person who could probably afford a vehicle, you would go with the highest end. So, and as today, if you're able to buy a new car over a used car, many people go for the new car because it's more of a status symbol. But one of the things to look at is between 1900 and 1925, the number of cars in the thousands that are sold. That's remarkable because that's a very, very quick turnaround. So how do you reform the urban landscape? Jane Addams in Chicago begins dealing with immigrants and poor working class families, trying to help them through settlement houses. So Hull House is a settlement house, and you would go and live there, and you would train to learn how to sew, or you would train as a workman. They would support hospitals, they would support education programs, and all of this was geared mostly towards the poorer class. Civic pride begins to take off during this period as well. You have baseball teams, the National Association of Baseball Players comes about during this period. You have the professionalization of sports, where different cities would have different teams that they would support. And so you have baseball games and baseball fields that begin to be built during the 1900s. And the idea was that you supported your city, and it was a mark of pride to have a nice big stadium that you could go and watch a baseball game with. And at the same time, this is the idea of leisure passing into the lower classes from the upper class. The idea of weekends begins to develop. And these are all progressive movements where it's important for people to step away from work and not be working 24/7. And so cities begin to encourage activities outside of being in the factory or working. The City Beautiful movement is a major progressive movement throughout the country, but it pushes for open spaces, gardens, trees, parks, where people can go and be in nature and away from the ugly buildings, tenement houses, and all of that of the city. The idea was it was a park-like environment for you to enjoy yourself. Riverside in Jacksonville has Confederate Park, as you see in the bottom middle postcard. That was part of the City Beautiful movement. The National Mall in Washington, D.C. is another aspect of that. And the Riverwalk in San Antonio, Texas is another example. So in 1893, you have the creation of the Anti-Saloon League, which is a temperance movement. And the idea is that you're fighting the abuse of alcohol. And so one of the things that comes out of this is temperance fountains, and these are water fountains. And this is something that we normally just take for granted when you're walking around cities and you see a water fountain. But this is where they start from. You have all of these anti-saloon leagues and temperance movements across the country that begin putting in water fountains so that it's a readily accessible source of water for people to drink. Hopefully that means that they would drink the water rather than go to the saloon and get a beer. or go drink alcohol. And so that was what they were kind of hoping to do. The 18th Amendment passes in 1920, and of course, the Anti-Saloon League is a huge proponent of that. And Henry Cogswell lives in San Francisco and is one of the major supporters or reformers for the temperance movement, who encourages the creation of these temperance fountains across the country. So the idea is that you're beginning to approach social ills in mass, in a large scale. The scientific temperance instruction movement was basically a educational process for phasing out alcohol. So you could do books through the mail, and they would help you overcome addictions to alcohol, but also help others get off of alcohol and stay away from alcohol. Okay. This is a great image. The drunkard's progress. So this is a depiction of what a typical process would be for a drunk. So step one would be a glass with a friend. Step two, a glass to keep the cold out. Then a glass too much. Then you're drunk and riotous. And so it's supposed to carry you through the cycle of alcoholism. It's a little bit over the top, maybe a little melodramatic, because step 9 is death by suicide. And you can see the woman and child at the bottom. That represents the widow and the child who's left fatherless because of his addiction to alcohol. And this was a common theme, that alcoholism was a social ill, and that it made people become less productive and would forsake everything in their life in order for alcoholism, or to drink alcohol. So when we're talking about alternative views of society, this was a big period of time for socialism. Eugene V. Debs, who was the head of the Socialist Party, becomes the presidential campaign. And we'll talk more about Debs as we talk about World War I, because he gets arrested for being anti-war. But the American Socialist Party is really, this is the period of time in which they have the highest membership that they ever will have. And you have organizations like the International Workers of the World, which was a trade union that begins to push for workers' rights within this period. So it's not unusual to see socialism emerging because of what they're talking about with society. These are ills brought about by a society that focuses heavily upon urbanization and industrialization, meaning capitalism. Capitalism was seen as creating these social ills within society. So the American Socialist Party emerges in 1901. Milwaukee is actually the hub of socialist activity, which is kind of unusual, and they're the first to elect a socialist mayor. But a lot of the support for the Socialist Party comes from Jewish, Finnish, and German immigrants. So you have a large number of immigrants that are part of this party. And between 1900 and 1912, the Socialist Party ran Eugene V. Debs as its candidate for president. In 1912, he had the best turnout he's ever had, with 6% of the popular vote. So it's kind of interesting to see this taking place. 1905, you have the International Workers of the World, created in Chicago, Illinois. They're combining unionism with the idea of industrial unionism, so that members are divided, or further divided, into the industry in which they work. This is a way to organize the union in such a way that it can tackle industries rather than try to approach it in one fell swoop. Um, and it's this idea that workers as a group should combine or what's the word I'm looking for? Um, should join together and be united as a social class. And here again, it's very heavily socialist. So they're looking to overthrow capitalism and wage labor and bring in what they call industrial democracy, where the workers are in charge of the day-to-day processes of the factory. So again, progressivism has very strong ties to the Socialist Party because a lot of what they're trying to do is they're trying to minimize the damage that's been caused by urbanization and industrialization. Henry George, in his book Progress and Poverty in 1879, has this kind of idea, they call it Georgism, but it's the idea that, let's say you have capitalists who are developing a portion of land, rather than have all these different taxes that people are paying that fall on everyone, if you would have what he envisioned as a land tax. So let's say, for example, you've got this piece of land and a company comes along and wants to build a factory on it. They bring in sewage, they bring in telephone, they bring in telegraph, electricity, all of these things. Well, the value of the land goes up as they're introducing all of these amenities to the land in order for the factory to run. So prior to the construction of the factory, this land was not worth as much as it is now that they have this big factory building here with all of these, with power, water, sewer, whatever. And so his argument was there should be a tax on the land such that when they begin to develop the land, the price would go up. And so therefore, if you had a tax, that tax would be higher. And so if you're taxing essentially the capitalist or the people who are trying to improve the land, then you don't really need to tax everybody else. It's a great theory. I don't really think it would work, only because I think it would act as a deterrent. But anyway, this was his idea of that people who are poor or in the working class should not have to pay taxes as much as the wealthy. And that's an argument that we'll hear a lot. Major cities where there's a socialist mayor. So this is a snapshot in a period of time. By World War I, socialism begins to dry out pretty quickly. You don't have as many places that will support the Socialist Party, largely because the socialist movement is anti-war. And so by that time, patriotism kind of keeps the Socialist Party from spreading. There are ideas also of how to structure towns that would support the industry. So George Pullman in the Pullman, Illinois town, these are the black and white pictures on the right, developed a town that where all the workers for the factory would live. And so they would provide for the homes, they would have garbage service, they would have running water and bathrooms. It was, these homes were state of the art, and you would pay rent back to the Pullman Palace Car Company for living there. And the idea was that this is a form of progressivism because you have a capitalist who is now designing a city or town for his workers. So it was taking them out of the tenements, taking them out of the urban core, and bringing them into this town of Pullman where they could live and they would have all these different amenities. And it would make the workers happier, healthier, and more productive. Mill towns in the South kind of borrow this model. You have an example is in Edenton, North Carolina, the Edenton Cotton Mill, where you had the cotton mill operating, and then all of the workers would live around it. And the mill town. The mill would actually build homes, and you would go to the store. The store would have all the goods that you would need, and you would buy things on credit. So when you got paid, they would subtract your bill from your paycheck, and that's what you would get from the mill in terms of your paycheck. So very different ideas, not necessarily what we would call radical or extreme, but these are also ways in which we start to see progressivism working its way into the corporate mentality.